James Harrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, looking down at the city below. The snow was falling harder now, coating Manhattan in white. At 55, he had everything money could buy: $1 billion real estate empire, homes around the world, and a fleet of luxury cars. But something was missing. His assistant, Margaret, knocked on the door. "Mr. Harrington, the board is waiting in the conference room." James didn't turn around. "Cancel it." "But sir, this is about the new development project." "I said cancel it." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Tell them something's come up." Margaret hesitated, then nodded and left. James walked to his private elevator, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the marble floor. In his office bathroom, he changed into the clothes he'd had delivered earlier: torn jeans, a threadbare coat, and scuffed boots. He messed up his silver hair and rubbed some dirt on his face. Looking in the mirror, even he barely recognized himself. Good, that was exactly what he wanted. The security guard at the back entrance didn't give him a second glance as he slipped out into the bitter cold. James had always believed that money showed people's true colors. Growing up poor in the Bronx, he'd watched how wealth changed people, usually for the worse. Now, after 30 years at the top, he was sick of the fake smiles and constant scheming. He found a spot on Fifth Avenue right in front of his own building. The irony wasn't lost on him. He sat down on the frozen sidewalk, hunching his shoulders against the wind. His employees rushed past, too busy with their morning routines to notice. The homeless man at their feet. Hours passed. The cold seeped through his clothes, making his bones ache. He watched as people hurried by in their warm coats and designer boots. Some actively avoided looking at him. Others wrinkled their noses and crossed to the other side of the street. "Would you like my hot chocolate?" The small voice caught him by surprise. James looked up to see a boy, no more than 7 or 8, holding out a steaming paper cup. The child was wearing only a thin jacket, his small hands red from the cold. "Don't you want it?" James asked, his voice rough. The boy smiled. "I already had some. My name's Tommy." James took the cup, feeling its warmth spread through his frozen fingers. "Thank you, Tommy. That's very kind." Tommy sat down next to him, on the sidewalk. Now that he was closer, James could see how worn the boy's clothes were. His sneakers had holes, and his jacket was at least 2 sizes too small. "Do you live here?" Tommy asked, gesturing to the street. James nodded slowly. "Today I do. What about you?" Tommy's smile faded a little. "Me and my mum stay at the shelter down the street, but only at night. During the day, we have to leave." James felt something twist in his chest. He'd donated millions to charities over the years, but somehow this one small boy was affecting him more than all those tax-deductible checks combined. Tommy shivered, and without hesitation, took off his jacket. "Here," he said, draping it over James's shoulders. "You need it more than me." "But you'll freeze," James protested. Tommy shrugged. "Mom says we have to help people when we can, and you look really cold." James stared at the jacket, then at the boy. In all his years of testing people, no one had ever shown such simple, unconditional kindness, especially not someone who had so little to give. A woman's voice called out, "Tommy? Tommy? Where are you?" "That's my mom," Tommy said, standing up. "I better go. You keep the jacket, okay?" Before James could respond, Tommy ran off toward a tired-looking woman in a waitress uniform. James watched as she hugged her son, checking him over with worried eyes when she noticed his missing jacket. James stood up slowly, his decision made. He'd seen enough. Right there on Fifth Avenue, in front of dozens of startled onlookers, James Harrington began to transform. He pulled off the ragged coat, revealing glimpses of the expensive suit he wore underneath. He wiped the dirt from his face with a monogrammed handkerchief. People stopped and stared. Phones came out, recording the moment a seemingly homeless man turned into one of New York's most powerful billionaires. "Tommy!" he called out. The boy and his mother turned, their eyes widening, as they recognized him from countless news stories and magazine covers. James walked over to them, ignoring the growing crowd of spectators. He knelt down in front of Tommy, who was clutching his mother's hand. "You gave me your jacket when you..." "Thought I had nothing," James said softly. Now let me give you something in return." Tommy's mother stepped forward protectively. "We don't want anything, Mr. Harrington. Tommy was just trying to help." James smiled. "Exactly. And that's why I want to help you both." He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Margaret, send the car around and call Stephen. Tell him I need an apartment prepared immediately. A good one, in the building on Park Avenue." He turned back to Tommy and his mother. "I have a warm apartment waiting for you both. And if you'll let me, I'd like to make sure Tommy gets into a good school. No strings attached, just one person helping another." Tommy's mother began to cry. "We can't accept—" "Please," James interrupted gently. "Your son showed me something I'd almost forgotten existed. Pure kindness. Let me show him that kindness." Gets rewarded. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Margaret stepped out holding a warm coat that she draped around Tommy's shoulders. The boy touched the soft material in wonder. "Sometimes," James said, leading them toward the car, "the richest people are the ones who have nothing but still give everything." As they drove away from the crowd of onlookers, James looked at Tommy's beaming face and felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. Maybe there was still good in the world. Maybe all it took was seeing it through a child's eyes. The Park Avenue apartment took Tommy's breath away. His eyes grew wide as he walked through the spacious rooms, touching everything with careful fingers as if afraid it might disappear. His mother, Sarah, stood in the doorway, still stunned by the sudden change in their fortune. "This is all ours?" Tommy asked, pressing his face against the window to look at the city below. "For as long as you want it," James replied. He watched as Tommy discovered each new room, the boy's excitement warming something in his heart that had been cold for too long. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "Mr. Harrington, this is too much. We can't—" "Please, call me James," he interrupted, gently. "And yes, you can. Tommy showed me something rare today. Pure kindness with no expectation of reward. Let me do this." But not everyone was happy about James Harrington's sudden act of charity. In his office the next morning, his younger brother Richard stormed in without knocking. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard slammed a newspaper on James's desk. The headline read, "Billionaire Harrington moves homeless family into Park Avenue." James didn't even look at the paper. "Good morning to you too, Richard." "This isn't funny, James. What will the board think? What will our investors say? You can't just pick people up off the street." "I can do whatever I want with my own money," James said calmly. "And that family has more dignity than half the people who sit in our boardroom." Richard ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. At 45, he looked like a younger version of James. But where James's eyes were kind, Richard's were cold and calculating. "The boy's mother is a waitress, for God's sake. Do you know what this will do to our reputation?" "It might improve it," James replied. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where he'd met Tommy. "When was the last time you actually helped someone, Richard? Not for tax purposes or good publicity, but just because it was the right thing to do." Richard's face reddened. "Don't lecture me about doing the right thing. I've helped build this company while you've been playing philanthropist." "Maybe that's been the problem," James said quietly. After Richard stormed out, Margaret came in with James's schedule. "Sir, the private school on 77th Street called. They can interview Tommy tomorrow morning." James nodded. "Thank you, Margaret. And could you have someone take Sarah and Tommy shopping?" "They'll need proper clothes. I've already done, sir." "And—" Margaret hesitated. "If I may say so, I think what you're doing is wonderful." Later that afternoon, James visited Tommy and Sarah in their new apartment. He found them still in a state of disbelief, sitting on the couch and looking around as if they might wake up from a dream. "How are you settling in?" he asked. Tommy ran to him with a piece of paper. "Look what I drew." It showed 3 figures, Tommy, Sarah, and James, standing in front of a tall building. "That's beautiful," James said, feeling an unexpected lump in his throat. Sarah stood up, smoothing her waitress uniform. "I should get ready for work." "Actually," James said, "I was hoping we could talk about that. I have a friend who runs a catering company. She's looking for someone to help manage events. The hours would be better, and you'd be home with Tommy every evening." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "Why are you doing all this?" James looked at Tommy, who was now drawing another picture. Because your son reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Money doesn't make you rich. Kindness does. But across town, in a luxurious office, Richard Harrington was making a phone call. "Listen carefully," he said into the phone. "I need everything you can find on Sarah Miller. There's no way she and that kid are as innocent as they seem. Nobody is that pure. Find me something I can use." The next few days were a whirlwind. Tommy started at his new school, wearing a crisp uniform and carrying a backpack that wasn't held, together with tape. Sarah began training at the catering company, coming home each night with stories about fancy parties and important clients. James found himself making excuses to stop by their apartment. He brought Tommy books about architecture, after discovering the boy's fascination with buildings. He helped Sarah navigate the overwhelming world of private school parents and Upper East Side society. One evening, as they sat around the dining table eating pizza, Tommy's choice, Sarah noticed James checking his phone. "Is everything okay?" she asked after Tommy went to do his homework. James sighed. "Just business. My brother thinks I'm making a mistake with all this." "We could leave," Sarah said quickly. "We don't want to cause problems." "No," James said firmly. "You're not causing problems, Richard. He's always been focused on appearances. He doesn't understand that sometimes the best business decisions have nothing to do with business." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You know, Tommy asks about you every day. He's never had a father figure in his life." James felt his heart skip a beat. But before he could finish, his phone rang. It was Margaret, and her voice was urgent. "Sir, you need to come to the office right away. Richard has called an emergency board meeting. He's trying to have you declared mentally incompetent to run the company." James stood up, his face pale. "I'll be right there." He turned to Sarah. "I have to go. Something's wrong." Sarah reached out and squeezed his hand. "Be careful." As James rode the elevator to the boardroom, he thought about Tommy's smile, about Sarah's quiet strength. He thought about the jacket a little boy had given to a stranger on a cold morning. The boardroom doors opened, and he saw Richard standing at the head of the table, surrounded by concerned-looking board members. "Ah, James," Richard said with a cold smile. "We were just discussing your recent, erratic behavior." James straightened his shoulders. He'd built this company from nothing. He'd survived poverty, betrayal, and countless attempts to take him down. He wasn't about to let his own brother destroy everything, not when he'd finally found something worth fighting for. The battle for Harrington Enterprises was about to begin. And somewhere in a Park Avenue apartment, a little boy was drawing another picture, unaware that he'd sparked a war that would change everyone's lives forever. The boardroom was silent, except for the sound of Richard's expensive shoes clicking against the floor as he paced. James sat calmly at the other end of the table, looking at the faces of board members he'd known for years. "Let me understand this," James said quietly. "You think I'm mentally unfit to run my own company because I helped a homeless family?" Richard spread photographs across the table, pictures of James sitting on the street in his disguise, giving Tommy and Sarah the keys to their apartment, having dinner with them. "This isn't just about one family," Richard said. "It's about your pattern of behavior. Canceling meetings, disappearing for hours, making impulsive decisions that affect our shareholders." "I've increased our profits every quarter for the past decade," James interrupted. "I've built this company from nothing." An older board member, Howard Matthews, cleared his throat. "James, we're just concerned. This isn't like you." "Maybe it's exactly like me," James replied. "Maybe I'm finally becoming the person I should have been all along." Richard smiled coldly. "You see, he's not even denying his strange behavior. As his brother and vice president, I have a responsibility to this company." "You have a responsibility to your own ambition," James snapped. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I see what this is. You've been waiting for an excuse to take control. We'll need you to take a leave of absence," Richard said, ignoring James's accusation. "Just until we can have you evaluated by professionals." James looked around the table again, seeing the uncertainty in some faces, the calculation in others. "And if I refuse, then we'll be forced to call an emergency shareholder meeting," Richard replied. "And I don't think you want that kind of publicity right now." James walked to the window, looking down at the city he'd helped build. You have until tomorrow morning to withdraw this ridiculous proposal. After that, I'll fight you with everything. I have. He left the boardroom without another word, his mind racing. In his office, Margaret was waiting with a worried expression. "Sir, there's something else you need to know," she said, handing him a file. Richard hired private investigators to look into Sarah Miller's background. James felt his stomach tighten as he opened the file. Inside were more photographs. Sarah at her old waitressing job, Tommy at their previous homeless shelter, and something else that made his blood run cold. "Is this verified?" he asked. Margaret nodded. "I double-checked. Everything myself." James sank into his chair, staring at the documents. Sarah had been keeping a secret, one that could change everything. Meanwhile, in their Park Avenue apartment, Sarah was helping Tommy with his homework when someone knocked on the door. She opened it to find a well-dressed woman with sharp features. "Mrs. Miller? I'm Victoria Harrington, Richard's wife." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "May I come in?" Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside. Victoria walked in, her expensive perfume filling the air. "What a cozy place James has set up for you," Victoria said, looking around with barely concealed disdain. "Tell me, how did you do it?" "Do what?" Sarah asked, although she already knew what Victoria meant. "Get James wrapped around your finger so quickly. I've known him for 20 years and I've never seen him act this way." Victoria picked up one of Tommy's drawings from the coffee table. "Using a child was clever, I'll give you that." Tommy came out of his room, stopping when he saw the stranger. Sarah quickly said, "Honey, why don't you go finish your homework?" After Tommy left, Sarah turned to Victoria. "I didn't use anyone. Your brother-in-law helped us because he wanted to." Victoria laughed softly. "Oh, you really are good, the innocent act, the grateful single mother. But everyone has secrets, don't they, Sarah? Or should I say, Angela?" Sarah felt the color drain from her face. "How did you—" "Richard is very thorough," Victoria said. "Does James know about St. Louis? About what really happened to Tommy's father?" "That was a different life," Sarah whispered. "I was a different person then." "Well, you better hope James sees it that way when he finds out." Victoria walked to the door, then turned back. "You have until tomorrow to leave. Pack your things, take the boy, and disappear. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." After Victoria left, Sarah sat on the couch, her hands shaking. She looked around the beautiful apartment at the life she'd dared to dream might last. Then she went to Tommy's room and watched him drawing, completely unaware that their world was about to shatter again. In his office, James was still staring at the file when his phone rang. It was Howard Matthews. "James," the old man said, "I've known you since you were starting out. You gave me a chance when no one else would. Now, let me give you some advice. Don't fight Richard. On this, he's been gathering support for months. He has evidence." "Evidence of what?" James demanded. "That I have a heart? That I care about more than just money?" "Evidence that Sarah Miller isn't who she claims to be," Howard said quietly. "And if this becomes public, it won't just hurt you. It'll hurt that little boy too." James hung up without responding. He pulled up the security cameras for the Park Avenue apartment building on his computer, watching as Victoria left, her triumphant smile visible even on the grainy footage. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "We need to talk. Please come. Over when you can." James closed the file and stood up. He'd thought giving Tommy his jacket that cold morning was a simple act of kindness. Now he realized it was just the beginning of a story that was about to become much more complicated as key. He rode the elevator down to his car. James thought about everything he'd built, everything he stood to lose. But then he remembered Tommy's smile, the way the boy's eyes lit up when he talked about buildings, the sound of his laughter at dinner. Some things were worth losing everything for. The snow had started falling again as James drove to Park Avenue, fat flakes swirling in the darkness. He thought about his own childhood, about the promises he'd made to himself, about the kind of man he'd become. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of those promises. Now, thanks to a little boy's kindness, he had a chance to remember who he really was. The question was, would Sarah's secret destroy everything before he had the chance? Sarah paced the living room, rehearsing what she would say to James. Tommy was asleep in his room, clutching the stuffed bear James had brought him last week. The city lights twinkled through the windows, a view she'd never dreamed she'd have. Now it all might disappear. The knock on the door made her jump. She opened it to find James standing there, his silver hair dusted with snow, his eyes tired but kind. "You wanted to talk?" he said softly. Sarah nodded, leading him to the couch. "Victoria came to see me today." "I know." James sat down heavily. "Richard had you investigated." "Then you know everything." Sarah's voice trembled. "I know there's something in your past that Richard thinks he can use against us, but I'd rather hear it from you." Sarah took a deep breath. "My real name is Angela Parker. 10 years ago in St. Louis, I was married to a man named David Miller. He wasn't a good man." James waited silently as she gathered her courage. "He drank a lot, got violent. One night when Tommy was just a baby, David came home drunk. He started throwing things, screaming. He went for Tommy's crib." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "I pushed him away. He fell down the stairs." "Was he killed?" James asked gently. Sarah shook her head. "No, but he was hurt badly. While he was in the hospital, I took Tommy and ran. Changed our names, moved from city to city. I was so scared he'd find us." "Did he try?" "For years. That's why we never stayed in one place too long. But then last year, I saw in the papers that he died in a bar fight." Sarah stood up, hugging herself. "I thought we were finally safe, that we could start over. And then you came along, and for the first time I let myself hope." James joined her by the window. "Sarah, or Angela, what happened wasn't your fault. You were protecting your child, but I lied to you," she whispered. "I'm not who you thought I was." "You're exactly who I thought you were," James said firmly. "A mother who would do anything to protect her son. Everything else is just details." Sarah turned to him, her eyes shining with tears. "Richard and Victoria said if I don't leave by tomorrow, they'll make sure everyone knows. The police, the school, the press, let them try." James's voice was steel. "I've dealt with worse than my brother and his scheming wife. But your company is just a company." James took her hands in his. "Sarah, when I sat on that street in disguise, I was looking for proof that humanity had lost its way. Instead, your son showed me that goodness still exists. You both gave me something more valuable than any business." A small voice came from the hallway. "Mom, are you crying?" They turned to see Tommy standing there in his pajamas, looking worried. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes. "Everything's fine, honey. Mr. Harrington and I were just talking." Tommy came over and wrapped his arms around his mother's waist. "Don't be sad, Mom. James will help us, right, James?" James knelt down to Tommy's level. "Always, buddy, no matter what." But across town, Richard and Victoria were putting their plan into motion. In their mansion study, Richard hung up the phone with a satisfied smile. "It's done," he told his wife. "I've called an emergency press conference for tomorrow morning. Once the media gets hold of Sarah's story, James will have no choice but to step down." Victoria sipped her wine. "And the boy?" "Child Services has already been notified about our concerns." Richard's smile turned cruel. "After all, what kind of mother lies about her identity?" "You're brilliant, darling," Victoria purred. "James never understood that sentiment is weakness. Business is business." But they didn't count on Margaret. Working late at the office, she overheard Richard's calls. As soon as he left, she went through his computer, copying files and sending urgent messages. In the Park Avenue apartment, James's phone buzzed. Reading Margaret's message, his face hardened. "Richard's making his move tomorrow morning," he told Sarah. "He's going to expose everything to the press." Sarah sank into a chair. "Then it's over." "No," James said. "It's just beginning." He looked at Tommy, who had fallen asleep on the couch. "I didn't fight hard enough for what mattered when I was young. I won't make that mistake again." He made some calls, his voice low and urgent. Sarah watched as the powerful businessman she'd first seen on TV emerged, taking charge, making plans. Hours passed. The snow fell thicker outside, blanketing the city in white. Around midnight, Margaret arrived with boxes of documents. "These prove Richard has been embezzling money for years," she explained, spreading papers on the dining table. "He's been stealing from the company's charitable foundation." James studied the evidence. Why didn't you tell me before? Margaret looked down. He threatened my job. I have kids in college. I was scared. But seeing what he's trying to do to you, to them. She gestured at Sarah and Tommy. Some things are more important than fear. As they worked through the night, preparing for the battle ahead, Sarah watched James. He'd taken off his tie, rolled up his sleeves, and was totally focused on protecting them. In that moment, she realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with him. Tommy stirred on the couch, and she went to cover him with a blanket. He blinked sleepily at her. "Is James still here?" he mumbled. "Yes." "Honey?" "Good." Tommy smiled. "He makes you happy, Mum, like the dads on TV." Sarah kissed his forehead, her heart aching with hope and fear. Dawn was approaching, and with it would come Richard's press conference. But as she watched James working tirelessly to protect her family, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt safe. The sky was just beginning to lighten when James stood up from the table. "It's time," he said. "Richard thinks he's going to destroy us with the truth about your past. Instead, we're going to tell your story our way." "How?" Sarah asked. James smiled, and for the first time she saw the steel beneath his kindness. "By reminding everyone that sometimes running away isn't cowardice, it's courage. And sometimes the real criminals aren't the ones hiding from the law, but the ones hiding behind it." As the sun rose over Manhattan, they prepared for the fight of their lives. But this time, Sarah wasn't running. This time she had someone worth standing her ground for. And in his sleep, Tommy smiled, dreaming of a future where he never had to be afraid again. The Harrington Enterprises lobby was packed with reporters by 8 in the morning. Camera crews jostled for position, and the buzz of conversation filled the air. Richard stood at the podium, Victoria by his side, both of them dressed impeccably for what they thought would be their moment of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his practiced smile gleaming under the lights, "thank you for coming on such short notice. We're here today to discuss a serious situation involving the leadership of Harrington Enterprises." The elevator doors opened, and James walked in. Sarah was beside him, holding Tommy's hand. The room fell silent. "James," Richard said, his smile faltering slightly, "I didn't expect you to attend." "Of course you didn't," James replied, walking to the podium. "You expected to destroy a family without giving them a chance to defend themselves." Cameras flashed as James took his place at the microphone. Sarah and Tommy stood just behind him, and Margaret quietly distributed folders to key reporters in the crowd. "My brother called you here today to tell you a story," James began. "A story about a woman who changed her name and ran away from her past. He thought this story would shock you, turn you against her. But let me tell you the real story." He gestured to Sarah, who stepped forward. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. 10 years ago, I was married to an abusive man who threatened to kill my baby boy. I did what any mother would do. I protected my child. Yes, I changed our names. Yes, we ran. And I would do it again to keep my son safe. Tommy squeezed her, hand looking up at her with pride. More cameras flashed. Richard stepped forward. "A touching story, but it doesn't change the fact that she's been living under a false identity. And James has been harboring..." "Harboring what?" James interrupted. "A brave woman, an innocent child. Tell me, brother, while you were digging into Sarah's past, did you think no one would dig into yours?" Margaret began playing a video on the lobby's large screen. It showed security footage of Richard meeting with known criminals, making suspicious transfers, doctoring foundation documents. "For the past 5 years," James continued, "my brother has been stealing from our charitable foundation. Money meant for homeless shelters, children's programs, domestic violence survivors, all redirected into his private accounts." The reporters erupted with questions. Victoria's perfect smile crumbled as she watched her husband's face turn pale. "That's a lie," Richard shouted, but his voice cracked. "The evidence has already been turned over to the SEC," James said calmly, "along with proof that you've been conspiring to take control of the company through false accusations about my mental state." An older woman pushed through the crowd. Ellen Martinez, head of the domestic violence shelter where Sarah and Tommy had stayed. "Mrs. Miller, Sarah," was one of our residents, Ellen announced. She's not just a survivor, she's a hero. She volunteers at our shelter, helping other women find the courage to leave abusive situations. She's saved lives. More people began stepping forward. Parents from Tommy's school, teachers, employees from the catering company. All speaking up for Sarah, sharing stories of her kindness and hard work. Richard tried to regain control. This doesn't change the fact that James has been acting erratically. You want to talk about my actions? James's voice filled the lobby. Let's talk about them. Yes, I sat on a street corner in disguise. Yes, I wanted to test people's humanity. And you know what I found? A little boy who gave his only jacket to a stranger. A mother who raised her son to be kind despite everything she'd been through. They showed me what real wealth looks like. He turned to the cameras. So yes, I helped them. And I'm going to keep helping them, and others like them. Because that's what this company was supposed to be about. Not just making money, but making a difference. Security guards appeared, moving toward Richard and Victoria. The police would like to speak with you both, one said quietly. As they were led away, Richard's face twisted with rage. You'll regret this, James. All of you. But no one was listening to him anymore. The reporters were crowding around James, Sarah, and Tommy, captivated by the real story, one of courage, redemption, and the power of kindness. Later that evening, in the Park Avenue apartment, Tommy was showing James his latest drawing. See? He said proudly. It's all of us. You, me, Mum, and Margaret. We're a family now. Sarah came in from the kitchen with hot chocolate for everyone. Tommy, honey, it's not that simple. Why not? Tommy asked. James makes you smile. He helps us. He fought the bad guys like a superhero. That's what dads do, right? James looked at Sarah, his heart pounding. You know, Tommy's right. It could be that simple if you want it to be. Sarah set down the hot chocolate. James, after everything that happened today showed me what I've known since that cold morning when your son gave me his jacket. Some things are meant to be. He took her hand. I love you both. I want to be a family. Tommy bounced excitedly. Say yes, Mom, please. Sarah looked at James, tears shining in her eyes. You really want this? Even with all my baggage, all my past? Your past is part of who you are, James said softly, and who you are is exactly who I want to spend my life with. As Sarah nodded, too emotional to speak, Tommy threw his arms around them both. Outside, the snow had started falling again, but this time it felt like a blessing, covering the old world and making everything new. Margaret, who had come by to deliver some papers, watched from the doorway with a smile. In the end, love had won. Not the fancy, perfect kind from magazines, but the real kind. Messy and complicated and beautiful, the kind that could turn a simple act of kindness into a story of redemption. The kind that could turn strangers into family. The kind that could warm even the coldest hearts. News of James Harrington's engagement to Sarah Miller spread through New York society like wildfire. Some called it a fairy tale, others a scandal. But James and Sarah were too happy to care about the gossip. Tommy was overjoyed, telling everyone at school that he was getting a real dad. But their happiness was about to face new challenges. One morning, as Sarah was planning a fundraiser for the domestic violence shelter with Ellen Martinez, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that spoke made her blood run cold. Hello, Angela? Or should I say Sarah? She gripped the phone tighter. David? But you're dead. I read about it in the papers. Her ex-husband's laugh was just as cruel. As she remembered. Amazing what money can do, isn't it? Make people disappear, make death certificates appear. Richard Harrington was very helpful with all that. Sarah's hands began to shake. What do you want? What's rightfully mine? My son. And now, thanks to your rich new fiancé, the money I deserve for all these years of separation. Tommy is not your son anymore. You lost that right when you pushed me down those stairs and kidnapped him. David's voice hardened. I wonder what the courts will think about that, or the press. James Harrington's fiancé, attempted murderer and kidnapper. Don't do this, Sarah whispered. Please. $10 million, David said, in cash, or they'll take Tommy and destroy everything you and Loverboy have built. After he hung up, Sarah sat frozen, her mind racing. Ellen found her there an hour later. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, she had, but she couldn't tell anyone, not even James. David had made it clear, if she involved the police or told James, he would take Tommy immediately. Across town, James was facing his own crisis. The board had called an emergency meeting following Richard's arrest. "The scandal is hurting our stock prices," Howard Matthews explained. "Investors are nervous. They want assurance that the company is stable." "The company is fine," James insisted. "Richard's crimes have been exposed, and it's not just about Richard anymore," another board member interrupted. "It's about your personal life." James felt his temper rising. "My personal life? Your engagement to a woman with a false identity, a criminal past. Sarah is a survivor, not a criminal," James snapped. "And my personal life is none of the board's business." Howard leaned forward. "James, we've drafted a prenuptial agreement, one that protects the company's interests. Have Sarah sign it and we'll back off." James stood up slowly. "You're trying to blackmail me?" "We're trying to protect what you've built," Howard said softly. "Don't let love blind you to reality." That evening, James came home to find Tommy waiting excitedly by the door of the apartment. "James, Mom's teaching me to cook. We're making your favorite pasta." But when James entered the kitchen, he knew something was wrong. Sarah's smile was strained and her eyes were red from crying. "Tommy, why don't you go set the table?" she suggested. After Tommy left, James pulled Sarah into his arms. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just wedding stress." James knew she was lying but didn't push. Instead, he said, "The board wants you to sign a prenup." Sarah pulled back. "Of course, that's completely reasonable. I'll sign whatever they want." "No," James said firmly. "I won't let them treat you like you're after my money." "But that's what everyone thinks," Sarah said quietly. Maybe we're moving too fast. Maybe we should wait." "Look at me," James said, tilting her chin up. "I don't care what anyone thinks. I love you. I love Tommy. We're going to be a family." Sarah turned away, tears falling. If only he knew the choice she was facing. David's threat hung over her like a sword. She had until the end of the week to get the money, or she'd lose everything: Tommy, James, this beautiful life they were building. That night, after Tommy was asleep, Sarah sat in the dark living room, looking at old photos on her phone, pictures of Tommy as a baby, before David's violence had forced them to run, pictures of their life on the road, always looking over their shoulder, and newer pictures, Tommy with James at the park, at his school play, building a snowman together. She made her decision. The next morning, she went to the bank and withdrew her entire savings, barely a tenth of what David demanded. Then she called Ellen. "I need to access the shelter's emergency fund," she said. "The one we use to help women escape quickly." Ellen was silent for a moment. "Sarah, are you in trouble?" "No," Sarah lied. "It's for someone else." "Please, Ellen, I'll pay it back." But even with that money, she was nowhere near 10 million. There was only one other option. While James was at work, Sarah went to his home office. She knew he kept emergency cash in the safe. "Old habit from my poor days," he'd joked. She knew the combination because he'd insisted there should be no secrets between them. Standing in front of the safe, Sarah felt sick. She was about to betray the man who had given her and Tommy everything. But what choice did she have? As she reached for the safe's handle, a voice spoke from the doorway. "I was wondering when you'd come here." Sarah spun around to find Margaret watching her. James's faithful assistant stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "How long have you been there?" Sarah asked. "Long enough," Margaret replied. "I've been watching you since that phone call yesterday. I know that look. I've seen it on too many women's faces at the shelter. Someone's threatening you, aren't they?" Sarah broke down, telling Margaret everything. When she finished, Margaret's face was grim. "We have to tell James." "No, David will take Tommy." "Sarah, listen to me," Margaret said firmly. "I've worked for James for 20 years. I've seen him fight battles you couldn't imagine. Trust him. Trust his love for you and Tommy." As they talked, neither woman noticed Tommy standing in the hallway, listening. His young face was set with determination. He went to his room and pulled out his phone, the one James had given him for emergencies. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he understood enough. Someone was trying to hurt his mum again, but this time was different. This time they weren't alone. Tommy dialed James's number, his small hand shaking slightly. When James answered, Tommy took a deep breath. "Dad," he said, using the word for the first time, "I think Mum's in trouble, and I think I know why she's been crying." James's hands gripped his office phone so tight his knuckles turned white. Tommy's words echoed in his mind. "Dad, I think Mom's in trouble." "Tell me everything, buddy," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Tommy spoke quickly, his words tumbling out. "Mom got a scary phone call yesterday, and now she's crying when she thinks I'm not looking. And I just saw her in your office with Margaret, talking about someone named David who wants money." James felt his blood run cold. David, Sarah's abusive ex-husband. The man who was supposed to be dead. "You did the right thing calling me," James said. "Stay with Margaret, I'm coming home right now." He hung up and immediately called his head of security, Frank Martinez, Ellen's husband and a former FBI agent. "Frank, I need everything you can find on David Miller. And I mean everything. He's alive and he's threatening Sarah." As his car sped through Manhattan traffic, James made more calls to his lawyers, to private investigators, to old friends who owed him favors. By the time he reached the apartment, he had a clearer picture of what they were dealing with. He found Sarah, Margaret, and Tommy in the living room. Sarah jumped up when she saw him. "James, you're home early." "David's alive," he said quietly, "and he's working with Richard." Sarah sank back onto the couch, her face pale. "How did you—" Tommy stepped forward. "I called him, Mum. I'm sorry, but you were so scared." Sarah pulled Tommy into her arms. "Oh, honey, don't apologize. I'm the one who's sorry. I should have trusted you both." James sat down beside them. "Tell me everything." As Sarah explained about David's call and his demands, James's face grew darker. When she finished, he took her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said. "You're not alone anymore. You don't have to handle this by yourself." "But he said if I told anyone, he's not going to touch Tommy," James said firmly. "Or you. Not ever again." Margaret, who had been quietly making calls of her own, spoke up. "Ellen's on her way with the police and Frank's team has located David." Sarah's eyes widened. "What? How?" "Because," James explained, "Richard wasn't as clever as he thought. He used company resources to help David fake his death and hide. Every transaction, every fake document, every hotel stay, it all left a trail." Tommy looked up at James with admiration. "Are you going to catch the bad guys like last time?" James managed a smile. "Yes, buddy, but this time we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone ever again." The elevator dinged, and Ellen rushed in with 2 police detectives. Close behind them was Frank Martinez, carrying a stack of files. "Mrs. Miller," one of the detectives said, "we need to take your statement about the threats Mr. Miller made." While Sarah talked to the police, Frank pulled James aside. "David Miller is staying at the Morgan Hotel under a false name," he reported. "And you're not going to believe who just went to meet him." James's jaw tightened. "Richard?" "Victoria," Frank corrected. "Apparently she's been running the show since Richard's arrest. She's the one who arranged David's whole resurrection scheme." Before James could respond, his phone rang. It was Victoria. "Hello, James," she said smoothly. "I believe we need to talk about how you and Richard helped an abusive man fake his death to extort money from his ex-wife." Victoria laughed softly. "About how you're going to transfer $50 million to an offshore account within the next hour, or David Miller is going to walk into the nearest police station with evidence that Sarah tried to kill him 10 years ago. You're bluffing, am I? We have hospital records, witness statements, everything needed to paint your beloved Sarah as a violent criminal who kidnapped a man's son." James looked at Sarah, who was still talking to the detectives, at Tommy, who was showing Frank his latest drawings, at the family he'd found when he least expected it. "The Morgan Hotel," he said into the phone. "Room 1542. I'll be there in 30 minutes with proof of the transfer." He hung up before Victoria could respond. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're not really going to pay them?" James smiled grimly. "No, I'm going to end this, but I need your help." While the detectives continued taking statements, James pulled Sarah aside. "Do you trust me?" he asked. "With my life," she replied without hesitation. "With Tommy's life." "Then let me handle this. Stay here with Tommy and the police. I promise. You after tonight, David will never threaten you again." Sarah grabbed his arm. "James, be careful, David. He's dangerous when he's cornered." "So am I," James said quietly. "When someone threatens my family." He kissed her softly, then knelt to hug Tommy. "Take care of your mom, buddy. I'll be back soon." Tommy hugged him tight. "Promise?" "Promise. And you know what? When this is all over, how about we make it official? Would you like that, being a real family?" Tommy's eyes lit up. "You mean you'd be my real dad?" "If you want me to be." Tommy threw his arms around James's neck. "I already told everyone at school you are." Fighting back tears, James stood and nodded to Frank. It was time to end this once and for all. As they rode the elevator down, Frank checked his weapon. "You know," he said, "when Ellen told me about Sarah and Tommy last year, I wanted to hunt David down myself. No one deserves to live in fear like that." "After tonight," James replied, "they won't have to." The snow was falling again as they drove to the Morgan Hotel. James thought about that cold morning when a little boy's kindness had changed his life. He thought about Sarah's strength, about Tommy's trust, about the family they were building. David and Victoria thought they could destroy that with threats and blackmail. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. In the hotel lobby, James straightened his tie and checked his briefcase. Everything was ready. "Remember," Frank said quietly, "we have to get them all on tape admitting to the extortion and fraud." James nodded. The elevator doors opened to the 15th floor. It was time to prove that love wasn't weakness. It was the greatest strength of all. Room 1542 of the Morgan Hotel was a luxury suite with a view of Central Park. James knocked on the door, his briefcase heavy with what Victoria and David thought was proof of a bank transfer. Frank and his team were monitoring everything from the room next door. Victoria opened the door, perfect as always in her designer suit. "Right on time, James. Come in." David Miller sat in an armchair by the window, drinking whiskey. He was heavier than in the old photos James had seen, his face red and puffy, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "So this is the great James Harrington," David sneered. "The fool who fell in love with my wife." "Ex-wife," James corrected calmly. "The woman you abused, the mother of the child you threatened." Victoria moved to the minibar. "Let's keep things civil, shall we? Do you have the transfer documents?" James placed his briefcase on the coffee table. "First, I want to know exactly what you're planning. How long have you been working with Richard on this?" "Smart," Victoria smiled. "Always getting the full picture. Richard saw an opportunity when you took in Sarah and the boy. It just took some digging to find David here and resurrect him. For a price," David added. "Your brother was very generous with company funds." James sat down, keeping his expression neutral. "And now you want 50 million more." "Think of it as an investment," Victoria said smoothly, "in your family's future. Pay us and David signs away all parental rights to Tommy. No messy custody battles, no criminal charges against Sarah. And if I don't pay," David leaned forward, "then I take my son, and Sarah goes to prison for attempted murder. Your choice." James opened his briefcase slowly. "You really think you can threaten my family and get away with it?" "We already have," Victoria smirked. "Richard may be in jail, but he set everything up perfectly. The evidence against Sarah, the offshore accounts, all of it untraceable." "Except," James said, pulling out a recorder instead of documents, "you just admitted to all of it." The door burst open. Frank and his team rushed in, weapons drawn. 2 police detectives followed. Victoria Harrington, David Miller, 1 detective, announced, "You're under arrest for extortion, conspiracy, and fraud." David lunged for James, but Frank was faster. He pinned David to the wall while the detectives read him his rights. Victoria's perfect composure finally cracked. "You can't prove anything." "Actually," James said, "we can. Richard kept records of everything. The money he paid David, the fake death certificate, all of it. He was always careful that way. And now he's agreed to testify against you both in exchange for a lighter sentence." As they led David away in handcuffs, He shouted, "That boy is mine. I have rights." "No," James said firmly. "You lost those rights the moment you raised a hand to him and his mother. Tommy will never have to fear you again." Back at the apartment, Sarah paced nervously while Tommy slept on the couch. When the elevator dinged, she ran to the door. James walked in, his tie loose, looking tired but triumphant. "It's over," he said simply. Sarah fell into his arms, sobbing with relief. "David, going to prison along with Victoria, they won't hurt us anymore." Tommy stirred on the couch. "Dad? You're back?" James's heart swelled at the word. He sat down and pulled Tommy into a hug. "I promised I would be, didn't I?" "Did you catch the bad guys?" "We did, buddy, and they can't hurt us anymore." Sarah joined them on the couch, and James held them, both close. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the city lights twinkled like stars. "There's something I need to ask you both," James said. "I was going to wait, do something fancy, but life's too short for waiting." He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside were 3 rings, an engagement ring for Sarah, and 2 simple gold bands. "I don't just want to marry you, Sarah. I want to adopt Tommy. Make us legally what we already are in our hearts, a family." Tommy's eyes went wide. "You mean you'd be my real dad on paper and everything?" "If that's what you want, buddy." Tommy threw his arms around James's neck. "Yes, yes, yes, yes." Sarah touched the rings with trembling fingers. "James, are you—" "Sure. After everything that's happened has only made me more sure." He took her hand. "When I sat on that street in disguise, I thought I was testing humanity. Instead, I found my humanity again. Through Tommy's kindness, through your strength, through the love you both showed me." Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, to all of it, yes." As James slipped the ring on her finger, Tommy jumped up. "Wait, I need to get something." He ran to his room and came back with a drawing. It showed their family, James, Sarah and Tommy, standing in front of their building. But now he'd added something, a little dog. "Since we're going to be a real family," Tommy said hopefully, "can we get a dog too?" James and Sarah laughed, the sound full of joy and relief and love. "I think," James said, pulling them both close again, "that can be arranged." Later that night, after Tommy was asleep in his room, James and Sarah stood at the window, looking out at the city. Her head rested on his shoulder, the ring sparkling on her finger. "I was so scared," she admitted. "When David called, I thought I'd have to run again." "You never have to run again," James promised. "Whatever comes, we face it, together." Sarah turned to look at him. "How did I get so lucky?" "I'm the lucky one," James said softly. "A little boy gave me his jacket on a cold morning, and in doing so, he gave me back my heart." In his room, Tommy slept peacefully, dreaming of his new family, of the dog they would get, of a future filled with love instead of fear. On his bedside table sat the drawing of his family, and beneath it, carefully preserved, was an old worn jacket, the one that had started it all. Some people might call it a fairy tale, a homeless boy and his mother finding their happily ever after with a billionaire. But James knew better. This wasn't about money or status or power. It was about the purest kind of wealth, the richness of a child's compassion, a mother's courage, and a love that could warm even the coldest of hearts. Spring came early to New York that year. The snow melted, revealing the first green shoots in Central Park. In the 3 months since David and Victoria's arrest, life had settled into a new, wonderful normal for the soon-to-be Harrington family. Tommy's adoption proceedings were moving forward smoothly. James's lawyers had fast-tracked everything, and David had signed away his parental rights as part of his plea deal. The ceremony was set for next week, just before the wedding. Sarah stood in what used to be James's home office, now converted into a planning room for both celebrations. Wedding details covered one wall, adoption papers another. In the middle of it all was Tommy's latest artwork, a family portrait that now included Max, the golden retriever puppy they'd adopted from the shelter. "Mrs. Harrington?" Margaret came in, smiling at how Sarah still blushed at the sound of her future name. "The dress designer is here for your final fitting." But before Sarah could respond, Ellen burst in, waving a newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she demanded. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. After everything they'd been through, bad news still scared her. But Ellen was grinning. They're calling it the Harrington Foundation for Family Justice. James is turning the company's charitable wing into a full-scale foundation to help families escaping abuse. And guess who he wants to run it? Sarah stared at the paper. There was a picture of her and James at a charity gala last week and details about the new foundation's mission. He hasn't said anything to me about running it, she said. Because, James's voice came from the doorway. I was waiting for the right moment. He came in carrying Tommy on his shoulders. They'd just returned from their weekly guys' morning, their special time together that usually involved ice cream for breakfast, and other things Sarah pretended not to know about. Down you go, buddy, James said, lowering Tommy. Why don't you show Margaret and Ellen your new baseball cards? As the others left the room, James took Sarah's hands. The foundation needs someone who understands what these families are going through, someone with the compassion to help them and the strength to advocate for them. James, I don't know anything about running a foundation. You know what matters most, how to help people rebuild their lives. The rest you'll learn, he smiled. Just like I learned about love from you and Tommy. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. When did you plan all this? That day on the street, when you gave me your story to tell at the press conference. The way you spoke about survival, about protecting Tommy, I knew then that your experience could help others. Sarah hugged him tight. I love you so much. Good, James whispered, because you're stuck with me. Speaking of which, he led her to the window. Below, in the courtyard of their building, workers were setting up for the wedding. White chairs, flowers, an arch covered in roses. 3 days, Sarah breathed. I still can't believe it's really happening. Believe it, James said, although I think Tommy's more excited about the adoption ceremony tomorrow. As if on cue, Tommy ran back in with Max bounding after him. Dad, can we show Mum what we got? James laughed. I thought we were keeping it a surprise. I can't wait. Tommy was practically bouncing. Please. All right, go get it. Tommy raced to his room and came back with a small box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with 3 intertwined hearts. The big one is Dad, Tommy explained. The middle one is you, and the little one is me. See how they're all connected? Dad says it's because no one can break up our family now. Sarah knelt down, letting Tommy put the necklace on her. It's beautiful, honey. And look. Tommy pointed to tiny words engraved on the back of each heart. It says, Forever Family. James watched them, his own eyes suspiciously bright. These moments still caught him off guard sometimes. The simple, profound joy of having a family. The next morning, they gathered at the courthouse for Tommy's adoption ceremony. Sarah helped Tommy with his tie while James paced nervously. What if I'm not good enough, he whispered to Sarah. Being a real father is different from being a friend. James Harrington, Sarah said firmly. You've been a real father to Tommy since the day you met him. The papers just make it official. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, called them in. Tommy held both their hands as they walked to the front of the courtroom. Thomas Miller, the judge began, then smiled. Soon to be Thomas Harrington, do you understand what's happening today? Tommy nodded solemnly. James is becoming my real dad, but he already is in my heart. Even the judge wiped away a tear at that. She looked at James. And do you, James Harrington, understand the responsibilities you're taking on? James's voice was steady. Your Honor, this boy gave me his jacket on a cold day when I pretended to have nothing. In doing so, he gave me everything. Being his father would be the greatest honor of my life. The judge signed the papers with a flourish. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of New York, I hereby declare Tommy officially and legally your son. Congratulations, Harringtons. Tommy threw himself into James's arms. We did it, Dad. Photographers caught the moment. The billionaire, crying as he held his new son, the proud mother watching through tears of joy. But none of them caught the most important part, the whispered, I love yous, the tight hugs, the feeling of finally being complete. That evening, they had a quiet celebration at home. Tommy insisted on making dinner, himself with Margaret's careful supervision. He'd even made place cards for the table, Dad, Mum, and Tommy Harrington in careful letters. As they ate Tommy's slightly oddly shaped but made with love pasta, Sarah looked at her boys. her family, and felt a happiness so deep it almost hurt. "Just think," Tommy said through a mouthful of garlic bread. "Tomorrow we get to practice for the wedding." James reached for Sarah's hand. "I can't wait to make you a Harrington too." "I already am," she said softly. "I have been since that cold morning when our son changed all our lives with one simple act of kindness." Tommy beamed at the words, "our son." Max put his head on Tommy's lap, hoping for a bite of pasta, and Tommy secretly slipped him a meatball when he thought his parents weren't looking. James and Sarah exchanged a knowing glance. This was what wealth really meant. Not the money in the bank or the company's success, but these precious moments of family love. Outside, spring flowers bloomed in window boxes, and the city hummed with life. But inside this warm apartment, three hearts beat as one, bound together by a child's compassion, a mother's courage, and a man's journey from loneliness to love. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Cherry blossoms floated on the spring breeze, dusting the courtyard where workers made final preparations. Sarah stood at the window of her dressing room, touching the three-heart necklace that hadn't left her neck since Tommy gave it to her. "Mom!" Tommy burst in, already in his little tuxedo. "Dad's not allowed to see you yet, but he wanted me to give you this." He handed her a small package. Inside was a worn jacket, the same one he'd given James that cold winter morning. A note was pinned to it. "This jacket changed my life. I had it cleaned and preserved. Maybe someday we can show it to our grandchildren and tell them how the greatest love story in the world began, with a little boy's kindness. Your James." Sarah hugged the jacket to her chest, tears threatening to ruin her makeup. Ellen rushed, "Over with a tissue." "None of that now," she scolded gently. "We spent 2 hours on that face." The dressing room was full of activity. Margaret coordinated with the wedding planner while the hairdresser made final touches to Sarah's elegant updo. But Sarah's eyes kept going to the jacket, remembering that morning that seemed so long ago now. Down in the courtyard, James was greeting guests. The city's elite had turned out in force, but so had families from the shelter, Sarah's co-workers, from the catering company, Tommy's teachers and classmates. James had insisted everyone who'd been part of their journey should be there. Frank Martinez approached with news. Victoria's request for appeal was denied this morning. She and David will serve their full sentences. James nodded. "Good. How's Richard doing in prison?" "Found God, apparently," Frank smirked. "Wants to teach financial literacy to other inmates." "Maybe some good will come of it all," James said. Then he smiled. "Speaking of good coming from bad situations," he looked up at the building, knowing Sarah was getting ready somewhere above. His heart felt so full it might burst. Tommy came running out. "Dad, Mom's almost ready, and she cried when she saw the jacket, but don't tell her I told you." James knelt down to straighten Tommy's bow tie. "How do we look, buddy? Ready to stand?" "Up with me?" "Ready," Tommy beamed. "I've got the rings right here." He patted his pocket proudly. The guests took their seats as music began to play. James stood under the flower-covered arch, Tommy by his side as his best man. Max sat perfectly groomed at Tommy's feet, a small ring of flowers around his collar. And then, the music changed. Everyone stood, and Sarah appeared. She was beautiful, in her simple white dress, carrying a bouquet of the same flowers Tommy had picked for their first family dinner. But it was her smile that took James's breath away, radiant with joy and love and the promise of forever. Ellen walked her down the aisle. They decided it was fitting. The woman who had helped them so much at the shelter, now helping Sarah take this final step into her new life. When they reached the arch, Tommy stepped forward with the rings. But first, he had something to say. They'd kept this part a surprise from Sarah. "Before Dad puts Mom's ring on," Tommy announced clearly, "I want to give her mine." He pulled out a third ring, a simple silver band that matched his adoption ring. "Mom, when Dad adopted me yesterday, we promised to be family forever. Now it's your turn." Sarah knelt down, not caring about her dress, and Tommy slipped the ring on her right hand. "I promise to be the best mom ever," she whispered. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Tommy said. "Both of you." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtyard. Even the judge who'd done Tommy's adoption wiped away tears. James stepped forward for the traditional vows, but then added his own. "Sarah, when your son showed me kindness that cold morning, he didn't just give me his jacket. He gave me a chance to see what really matters in life. You both taught me that true wealth isn't in bank accounts or business deals. It's in the love we give away. I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me." Sarah's voice shook as she responded, "James, you saw us when we were invisible to the world. You gave us safety when we were afraid, hope when we had none, and love when we needed it most. But most importantly, you gave Tommy something I couldn't, a father who shows him every day what it means to be a good man. I promise to love you, support you, and remind you every day that you're the best investment we ever made." Tommy held up the rings proudly. As James slipped the wedding band on Sarah's finger, joining her engagement ring and Tommy's family ring, the spring sunlight caught all three, making them sparkle. "By the power vested in me," the judge said, smiling, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." But before James could kiss his bride, Tommy tugged on his sleeve. "Don't forget the most important part." James laughed and knelt down. Together, the three of them shared a family hug while the guests applauded and Max barked excitedly. The reception was a joyous blend of elegant and casual. Children from the shelter played with kids from Tommy's private school. Business executives chatted with social workers. The barriers that usually divided New York society melted away in the warmth of the celebration. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in beautiful colors, James led his new wife to the dance floor for their first dance. Tommy insisted on joining them, and soon others followed. "Look," Tommy pointed to the sky. "A shooting star." "Make a wish," Sarah said. Tommy shook his head. "I don't need to. I already got everything I wished for." Later that night, after the guests had gone and Tommy was asleep with Max curled up at his feet, James and Sarah stood in their living room. The preserved jacket hung in a special display case, a testament to how the smallest act of kindness can change lives forever. "Mrs. Harrington," James said softly, holding her close. "Mr. Harrington," Sarah replied, then laughed. "It still feels like a dream. If it is, I never want to wake up." They danced slowly to music only they could hear, their rings glinting in the city lights. On Tommy's bedside table, a new drawing showed their family: Mom, Dad, Tommy, and Max, surrounded by hearts and shooting stars. And so ended the story that began with a jacket given freely on a cold winter morning. The story that proved love is the greatest wealth of all, and that sometimes the purest hearts are found in the most unexpected places. The next morning, a small item appeared in the society pages. Billionaire James Harrington married Sarah Miller in an intimate ceremony, officially adopting her son Tommy. But the real story, sources say, began months ago with an act of kindness that warmed the coldest of days and changed three lives forever. In the Harrington home, the newspaper lay unread. They were too busy being what they'd always dreamed of, simply perfectly, wonderfully a family.